Flutter BLoC is an alternative to setState and provider. If you are new to Flutter, use setState. If you're having problems with setState, provider is likely easier. If you're having problems with provider or don't like it, try Flutter BLoC. This is a beginner tutorial for people with no experience with BLoC. It introduces the concept of separating out the business logic of your application, which is the primary difference from provider. The tutorial also covers 3 distinct states of the application. Because this is a really basic tutorial, it only covers Cubit. It doesn't actually cover BLoC, but they are very closely related. You can start with a Cubit in your code and swap out a BLoC with very little modification. We're going to start with our brand new Flutter project, so completely blank, completely brand new, just to build up the concepts of BLoC one by one. I'm going to run it on the Windows platform, but most people are going to run it on iOS or Android. There's no difference in the code between this type of Windows desktop application and an Android or iOS app. I'm calling my app b_setup for BLoC setup. We're actually going to have to cover some of the VS Code extensions that I'm using with BLoC just to make the code generation a bit easier. Add Flutter BLoC to your project with Flutter pub add Flutter_BLoC. Notice that Flutter BLoC also installs provider as well as BLoC. We're also going to install this package called Equitable and random_color. For the random color package, I'm going to use the null safety version. So let's first add Equitable. You're going to need this for Flutter BLoC, otherwise you have to do some boilerplate code to set up the equality between the objects. And we'll also add the random color package. For the random color package, because I'm using the null safety version and it's not the default version, I'm going to add the actual specific version of it into the pubspec.yaml file. So just copy the version that is 1.0.6 - null safety. And it's possible by the time you watch this video that the default version will be the null safety version. Once we have the packages added to your project, we're going to go into the main.dart file and delete everything there just to focus on these main concepts of BLoC. So I like to start off with a completely blank app, just so that every line that we add, you can understand why we added that specific line. We are going to return the material app, which is, it's almost every Flutter app is using this material app. So at this point, you can run your app and test it out. It's going to be an all black screen. There's no app bar. There's nothing on it, which is exactly what we want because we just want to focus on these concepts. In VS Code, make sure you have the BLoC extension as well as Dart data class generator. This will make it easier to generate some boilerplate code that we'll need just to focus on the main concepts of what BLoC is. So now that's set up, if I right click on the lib folder, I can scroll all the way to the bottom and there's Cubit, new Cubit. So I'm going to call my Cubit color. So I'm just going to change the color of the background of the screen. Now, thanks to this awesome extension, I have this new Cubit folder that's automatically created. And within the Cubit folder, I have my Cubit and I have a state of the Cubit. Also, my Cubit state automatically is extended from Equitable. So we're going to have the material app home be a BLoC provider. The syntax of the BLoC provider is the same as provider if you're familiar with provider. So if you're not familiar with provider, it's actually pretty straightforward. There's this create : and then you have the parentheses, and in there you drop in the context. And you have it do the The callback is your name of your qubit that was automatically created for us when we did the right click. And it's called color qubit. So very similar to provider. And this thing will require a child. Again, it's the same syntax as provider. So the BLoC provider, it requires these two parameters. One is create, and the other one is the child, which we'll just start off with something simple, maybe like a container or something. And by wrapping the app, by wrapping the BLoC provider around the app, that's just how we're going to connect all the different parts of the state. However, unlike provider, we are going to need to use this thing called a BLoC builder. And that's how we're going to get the screen to update when there is a change to the state. So we're going to have the child be the BLoC builder, and we're going to pass it to two qubit and the state that was created for us earlier. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see it. It's the name of the qubit and the name of the state. So now that we have the framework for the state management set up, we can now do the fun part of editing the state. So let's check out our color state here. And notice that it's extending equitable. So that is going to make it a lot easier for us to compare the different objects, and we don't have to put the boilerplate code in. We'll create a final instance variable for the color state because it's always going to have a color in this case. And we'll just call it color. And the constant constructor, we'll just pass it the color. And we'll set up the color initial. So the color initial is the first state. So it's the initial state of the app. When the app, we're going to tell it when it first loads to load the initial color state. I'm going to set it to a drab gray because it's the initial state, and it'll be more obvious when we change the state. For the initial state, I'm going to use the super, and then that will call up the initial color state class and set the initial color to colors.gray, which is part of the material colors by default. So now, if you go into your container and the color parameter, you can access the state right there, state.color. And now we can start accessing the state of the color qubit from the color state. And you could move this around. This is the whole purpose here. The magic is starting to happen. I'm going to add a floating action button to get some interactivity onto the app. You could put any type of button here. I'm just using this one because it's a little bit easier. You don't have to have a child for the floating action button. And just to make sure the button is working, I like to test it initially. Let's put a little test message in here that maybe some change is coming. We're going to change the state just to remind us to connect the button press to the change of state in the future. So now we have this completely humongous floating action button that's completely waiting. It's begging for some interaction here. And so let's use it to change the state. So in order to change the state, we have to create another state. So the first state is this color initial. It's the initial state of our application. We're going to create another state. So the basic concept is that you're downloading some type of information from the internet, like a video or a file, or you're getting it from a Ricoh Theta camera. So the second state will be when you've downloaded the asset that you're trying to download. So in this case, to make it simple, we're just using a color. So we're going to call the second state color downloaded. And in your mind, just imagine this is some fantastic and huge 360 video file from Ricoh Theta, and you're enjoying some VR experience. But for now, it'll just be a color. So after the color is downloaded, we're going to set a new color. And this would be similar to, if you had downloaded a big video or some big image here. But we'll just call ours new color so you can see what happens when you change the state of your application. So the state has a const constructor, and it's going to accept a new color. and then it's going to set the super with the new color that it receives. So pretty simple. So in the color Cubit, the actual Cubit, we're going to make a change here, and we're going to create a method to actually change the color. And that method is going to use something called emit. So it's going to emit a new state here. And the state that it's going to emit is the color downloaded. So emits a new keyword for this BLoC pattern. And it's going to emit the color downloaded. And initially we'll set it to red just so that it's obvious that there's been a change of state here. And although there are more files here than with some type of state management, like for example, provider, you may want that separation. This is actually the reason to use BLoC, so that you can separate out the state and the business logic. So now that's set up, we can now go back to our humongous floating action button and use the button on pressed to change the state. So we're going to use context.read. If you're familiar with provider, it's almost exactly the same. We're going to have a Cubit, and then after the period here, we can access the method from that Cubit, which is change color. And boom, it works. So you can see that the Cubit is sending over states to the UI. The UI is running a function, and that changes the state. To keep the tutorial short, there is no separate data class. I'm going to use the random color as a way to simulate some type of data server that's sending data over to the Cubit. The BLoC is very similar to the Cubit. It does add events. So instead of having the UI run the function, you can have it send an event. You can start off with Cubits and swap in a BLoC into your app later. It's recommended to start with Cubits and only use BLoC when you need it. So normally there'd be a separate data class to hold the data, and then you'd pull it from some type of server or the camera. But to keep the tutorial short, I'm going to use this random color package just to be able to change the color randomly. And I'm just going to jam it here into the change color method. But in your mind, you should be thinking that in the future, this would be pulling it would access a method on a data class, and that would then get the data into your application. So we're focused on showing the interaction between the Cubit and the UI, and also how the Cubit breaks up the state from the business logic. So we're just going to drop in a random color here every time that you change the color from the Cubit. To actually change the state effectively, we're going to have to go back into the color state, and the equitable package has a property list here, and we're going to have to add the color to the property list to make sure that everything's going here. Otherwise, it won't update. So now that we can change the colors, we're going to add a little bit more network simulation. Ideally, this would be in a separate class, but I'm just going to put it right here into the change color method so that the tutorial is a bit shorter. So we're going to have async, because if it were simulating coming from the network, there might be some network delay. And we're actually going to add a simulated network delay so that we can see the state of the application when it's loading something from the network. So I'll just put a future delayed here to put a 1 second delay, and imagine that it's taking maybe 1 second to download a big image or maybe a small video file here. The delay theoretically could be longer, but we'll just use async await to put a 1 second delay. So at least we can show a loading spinner if the state is that it's fetching the data from the network. So now that we have this fake network delay, we're going to go back into our color state and create a new state for when that's downloading this color from the fake server. So we'll call it color network fetching. Just to be nice and clear that the state is that it's coming over from the network, even though the network itself is fake in this example. So we'll extend the color state and we'll have a constant constructor. We'll use the same gloomy gray as the default color for the loading state, just so that maybe the spinner, the progress indicator, will look a little bit brighter compared to the gray background. So super will just pass it gray again. So now the cool part is that we have a new state for fetching the color. So every time we change the color, we could set it to first set the state that it's fetching the color, and then after it receives the color, then it will change the color. So again, this would probably be better to have in a separate data class, but for this tutorial, I'm just jamming it into this change color method. And then we'll first emit the state for that it's the color network fetching. Then it's going to wait for a second, and then it's going to change the state, emit a new state. So within the BLoC builder, back in main.dart, we have the state from the builder, right? So we can now check to see if the state is one of the states that we have, right? So we have 3 states. We have the color downloaded, we have the initial color, and we have the color is being fetched from the network. So if the state is the color downloaded or the state is the color initial, we want this default screen here, which is this humongous floating action button and the background screen. But if it's a different state, then we might want to show the loading spinner for now. So we'll set up an else check. So if the state is either color has been downloaded or it's a color initial, then it'll have this nice humongous floating action button. Or else we're going to show a loading spinner, because these are the 2 conditions that we have right now. It's either loading or it's showing the color. We'll have it return a circular progress indicator. And then we'll do a hot restart. And there it is. So right now the network delay, simulated network delay, is always 1 second. I'm not going to put a error, so like a failed network error in here, although that would be another state to add next. But we'll just have it be if it's fetching the data from the network, it's going to show the circular progress indicator, and then we'll just stop it for this shorter tutorial. So the else will just be a container. It won't be checking for a network error in this particular tutorial. So now that we have the BLoC state management set up, the next step is to connect it to the camera. So if you want to try this, subscribe to the channel, and you can see the updates when we update this type of tutorial. If you are interested in using BLoC for state management and to separate out the business logic, give the video a like so that we know that we should put a bit more resources into this type of video. And have fun with Flutter BLoC.